Welcome everyone. Today we have an edition of Izen in the dark. Why? Because the light is too far away. So we're gonna stay like this for now. It's Saturday, we are in the weekend for now, and we have now gone enough days away from the release of Dragonflight that we can draw a few conclusions about the start of this expansion, right? I believe most people have had time to either level to full their first character and start playing in the endgame. Maybe you almost made it in the endgame, you have been able to try a few or many of the features of the expansion. So it is time to start talking about how this release has been so far, what are the features that have impressed you and impressed me the most, which ones I found very good and which ones have been perhaps not. First point that we have to say, and I share as well, I hope that most of you have found the same feeling about the release of this expansion, is the fact that the leveling was better. At the very least, when it comes to my experience, I thought that the leveling experience was very nice compared to Shadowlands. Of course, some players might enjoy Dragonflight purely because the leveling experience also included flying, which is something that the Shadowlands experience did not. Being honest, I still think zones like Revendreth are still better than what Dragonflight has to offer. Perhaps to some people even Ardenweald might have been better than what Dragonflight had to offer. But when you take into account the fact that you are able to fly around in Dragonflight and the fact that overall I believe the storyline were cooler in Dragonflight compared to Shadowlands. So for me, it was a pretty nice leveling experience. I did not have nearly as much of a drag, nearly as much of a boring time leveling two different characters back to back in the first day of the expansion. That's the first thing for me, the leveling part. But as we all know, leveling is only the very first tiny fraction of an MMO. The next, let's assume 2 years of this expansion will be spent in the endgame for many players. How has the endgame been? How have the activities of the Dragonflight expansion been compared to what we have been used to do in previous expansions? So first thing worth pointing out is that I'm sure you might have noticed by now, since we are just about very close to getting our first reset of world quests. The first point to note is that there are far less world quests available in Dragonflight compared to Shadowlands, and also by extension compared to BFA and compared to Legion. World quests now will spawn on Wednesday, and they will either last the entire week or they will end by midweek, by Saturday. And then on Saturday you will get a few more that will last until Wednesday, and then you will get the full reset once more. So it's not like previous times where you would log in, fill your entire quest tracker by a dozen or so AP world quests, and then the next day or so you log in again, and once again you have more world quests for AP to clear, like we had for our previous expansions. Now instead the amount of world quests you have to complete is much lower. We do have, however, compared to previous expansions, way more weekly quests as well as way more daily quests that you can complete, because you have the weekly quests for professions that you can take, you have the weekly quests for certain factions, as well as daily quests from the camps of the Maruk centers. What is also quite different compared to Shadowlands were the weekly events, the weekly community events that Shadowlands did not have. Because pretty much the only weekly event available at release in Shadowlands was the world bosses. Now, world bosses have been taken away in Dragonflight for the community events. So for the Siege of Dragonbane Keep in the Waking Shores, for the Grand Hunts of the Centers, as well as the Feast. The Taskar soup you have to make and get some loot and some world buff that you can get once a week. So those are going to be also an addition to your activities every week. I think this as well has been a positive change compared to what we had before, like, you know, diversifying the content. Previously, what we have been told we needed to do from Legion all the way up to Shadowlands, it was just log in, open up your map and look for world quests, and generally look for AP world quests because that's important. In Shadowlands, that was even worse, because in Shadowlands, world quests did not give you the type of AP that rewarded character power, that rewarded you with some gear, with some powerful things for you. Instead, it was just anima for cosmetic effects and power-ups of your Covenant Hall. So not nearly as important, and players very quickly stopped paying attention to anima. So it's definitely been a different set of end game activities compared to previous expansions. What has perhaps been one of the largest changes compared to what we were used to is that we don't really have a specific end game zone. When you look at Legion, the first patch, the first part of the expansion, you had Suramar, and then you had the Broken Shore, and then you had Argus. Those were basically the zones you were pigeonholed in. And then in Shadowlands, you had the Mo as the special endgame zone, followed by Cortia as the special endgame zone, and then lastly by Zareth Mortis as the special endgame zone. So the vast majority of the continent, carefully crafted by the Blizzard art team, by the devs, as well as the art team, went unnoticed, undeservedly unrecognized, because you ditched it quite quickly to be just stuck into a very tiny zone for your endgame activities. This does not seem to be a thing in Dragonflight because you have things to do across the world. Still, we don't have just a tiny zone to end up in once we hit max level. You can still chill around the Azure Span if you have to do wall quests in there, and then you can move to the Maruk Center or Onaran Plains if you want to do some grand hunts, or if you try to grind for some animals, for skinning, or for herbs, for herbalism, and then back to the Waking Shores to the Elite Zone. There are way more ways to go around the world and find useful things to do in different parts of the regions of Dragonflight compared to previous expansions as well, which can keep things fresh. As we know, many players have still PTSD from their experiences in the Mo. Their experiences in being unable to mount, having to constantly run in a very tight, narrow place filled to the brim with enemies, also pretty dangerous and annoying to deal with enemies. So by comparison, it's a much better improvement compared to the last expansion. We can of course still remind, it's never too much, we still have our flying for the end game, which is not something we had in all the previous expansions from the get-go. Of course, in this case you can also praise it even more because it's not actually flying, it's dragon riding, so it's a different kind of flying. I was going to say with utmost certainty it was a better kind of flying, but apparently, if you go and listen to certain people, certain special people, this is actually not a very good type of flying. It's actually bad, and some of these individuals do want their normal flying back because they don't enjoy dragon riding as much. I wouldn't worry too much about these kind of people. After all, they've all been caught and brought back to the mental asylum they deserve to be in, so that's out of the way. We can also then, at least for me, still be quite happy about how professions have been going. If we look at the previous state of professions, it was a dire affair because professions had been essentially abandoned by Blizzard as being a very simple, just go to the auction house, buy a few of these materials and reagents and whatnot, then go in front of the trainer and then just craft a bunch of things until you hit max, and there's your profession done with. This has been a thing for several expansions now, and Dragonflight has completely reworked and changed massively how the professions are working. They are now much more immersive. You now have way more ways to make professions feel part of the expansion, part of the world. You have profession features like weekly quests and different quests depending on your profession. You have secret treasures you can find in the world to give you more skill points for your profession. You have secret trainers, special trainers you can find in the world to give you more profession reagents. You have also special tools, special ways to craft specific things. Very, very role-play-esque, in a very role-play way, like having to capture the soul of particular elite elementals, so you can then capture the elemental soul and then use the elemental soul to craft very good epic quality gear, for example. It's very, it's very thematic, it's very atmospheric and fitting for the professions to work like this, to put you into the open world and have you do some content compared to the state of professions in the past. You can still, of course, have a few doubts here and there with the introduction of the crafting order system, because as it stands, the majority of the professions to be maxed need to go through the crafting order system, so you have to interface yourself with this new system. Blizzard has made sure that once they introduced this, they found a way to essentially force players to get into the crafting order element of professions. So I'm afraid you will have to, if you want to be a good profession crafter, deal with this new auction house styled system. We cannot still give any judgments on the raid, of course, and mostly not on the dungeons as well, as Mythic Plus is still not open yet. But I think overall, the several changes that have been implemented in Dragonflight have been received positively, from the dragon riding, first of all, to the leveling with flying, and as well as the leveling experience in general, plus the new way, the new style of professions being completely reworked from the past, and the wider, larger ways to have time, to spend time to do something in the open world in different ways also, not just forced to do the typical world quests of the past or to be pigeonholed in a single small zone and do a handful of daily quests in that small zone like in the past. Instead, now we seem to have more ways to spend our time in the open world, whether you are trying to maximize your renown to get patterns and recipes for particular crafts of your profession, or to simply get the cosmetic rewards of the different renown factions, or you're trying to even maximize different factions, like minor factions, not just the main 4 ones, but factions like the Sabellian or Rathian debate in the Obsidian Citadel, or something like the Cobalt Assembly for grinding the cosmetic rewards in there, or simply the item level 389 ring that's in there. So you do have different ways and different methods to spend your time in Dragonflight, which I have been enjoying quite a lot at the moment. I think many players have. I think overall it has been a quite positive reception of the expansion launch, besides of course the first perhaps day of server issues that some players, some more unlucky players, have suffered. Myself particularly, I had to wait about 80 minutes before I was able to log in on launch. A few hours later we had still some server lag, a little bit of instability around there, but after that it's been smooth sailing, at the very least for me. So maybe some players have been more unlucky and they have found a bit more server troubles for themselves, but I wouldn't say it's too terribly bad for a release launch of an expansion. Besides that, I think so far the release has been quite successful and the game itself looks quite good. Of course, these are early talks. We have seen these types of, perhaps not to this level, but we have seen these types of positivity posts, threads and videos about the release of Shadowlands as well. If you were to ask me right now, I would tell you that the most complained about things at the release of the expansion have been, ironically, dragon riding itself, as well as the direction of the story, the direction of the quests, and the certain development of certain characters, which is a very good thing if you are playing an MMO. If you are playing an MMO and the most players are going to complain about is the story or the characters or the flying, the way you fly in the world, and it's not complaining about the systems of the game, it's not complaining about the features of the game, the content in the game, then it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing to not have this type of problem right now, compared to the type of problems we had at launch in Shadowlands. So I think overall it has been a very good launch, a very good state of the game at launch, let's just say in the first patch of the expansion. Very good quality release. I hope it's going to continue this way until the rest of the expansion, and I hope we won't get to wait too long for the first major patch and the first major content addition to the game, so that we sour the experience, we sour the memory of this very first good release and good first part of the expansion. That is my thought on the release of this Dragonflight expansion for now. Now, after this being said and done, after me having given you my 50 cents on how I feel about the release of this new expansion, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your weekend. You are of course free to let me know in the comments what do you think about yourself about this expansion, what have been your experiences in this new fresh launch, whether you were trying to min-max multiple characters at once, whether you were trying to be a profession master, trying to quickly push for very good profession making and profession crafting, or if you were trying to take it a little bit more laid back and are still relaxing, leveling for example. You can still let me know your thoughts and your opinions on the expansion and how have you felt so far. Starting first with our thanks to my Patreon supporters. Thanks for the contribution and the help to grow myself and this channel. You can still support in other ways, which don't include spending cash, dinero, money, pesetas. You can do so by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Those methods will still be more than enough to support. And lastly, you can find me in other ways, like following me on Twitter. You can support me by subscribing to my Patreon, which will also give you access to my Discord server. And lastly, I am also found on Twitch, streaming generally past 10 p.m. in Europe, 1 p.m. Pacific US times, and 4 p.m. Eastern US times as well. With this out of the way, thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, yeah, I enjoy this night thing when making the video. It's less light in my eyes, it's more laid back. I'm a fan, personally.